As Reconstruction came to an end in Louisiana and throughout the South, white Democrats reasserted control of state politics through a series of legal maneuverings and intimidation against African Americans and white Republicans when that did not work. In this way, they reasserted white supremacy. The white Democrats who took control in Louisiana were known as the Bourbons, and that refers to the royal houses of France and Spain. The ruling house of Spain, even today, is called the House of Bourbon. And so what we'll see is that Louisiana will undergo a period of what is called retrenchment, that is, withdrawal, pulling back, high conservatism, very little public expenditure. So we'll see the Bourbons, and then we'll see one of their notorious leaders, Mr. Edward Burke. Then Governor Francis T. Nichols, the politics of race, Bourbon power centers, and the Constitution of 1879. Most Bourbons came from the cotton and sugar planter class in the country and wealthy merchants in the city. They followed and adhered to white supremacy. And as a part of this, they enacted conservative fiscal policies, limited government, and very few appropriations, because if you spent money on the government, the Civil Rights Acts of the federal government was still in force, and it would have mandated that the states pay for the expenditures for African Americans as well. So if you didn't spend it on anybody, then nobody got it. And because of this, Louisiana became a backwater. Few facilities, few roads and bridges, few benefits for those other than protection for rich whites. Who are some of the notable Louisiana Bourbons? Leon Yastrzemski, the mayor of Baton Rouge. Henry Hersey, the editor-publisher of the New Orleans Daily States. Members of the Ring, that's a political machine in New Orleans. The supporters of the Louisiana Lottery Corporation, and the supporters of the work convict lease system, better known as the James Gang. Among the most colorful and most corrupt politicians Louisiana has ever seen, none were more than Edward Austin Burke. He was a self-proclaimed ex-Confederate major. There were plenty of people that loved to go around the South in those days, saying that they were an officer in the Confederacy. Well, in Burke's case, he was probably a Union spy. And the only reason that he was a Union spy is that the Union paid better money than the Confederates. After the war, he became the treasurer of the state of Louisiana, which made him the second most powerful man on paper, but it made him actually the most powerful man. He was boss of the Democratic Party. He was editor of the New Orleans Times Democrat newspaper. Not a particularly virulent racist. He was a racist. He's more of an opportunist. He knew how to play race politics. Sounds like somebody we know. What you see here is the plaque alongside what used to be the Liberty Monument down by the foot of Canal Street and then behind the Canal Place Theater. And there you see him, fourth from the top, Major E.A. Burke. This is the Burke Mansion that is still quite prominent on St. Charles Avenue, although the Burkes have not lived there for quite a long time. Not all the Bourbons were of one mind and one thought. Case in point was Francis Redding T.U. Nichols, whom we know as Governor Nichols or Governor Nichols. He was the governor who was recognized by the federal government. He lost an arm during the Civil War fighting for the Confederacy. Inherently, he's a decent man. He does believe in white supremacy. I'm not going to excuse him for that. But he believed in the humane and decent treatment of African Americans. He believed in tax integrity, that is, taxes should be even for everyone, and he was a staunch opponent of the lottery. And for this, he quickly ran afoul of his Bourbon contemporaries because of his policies and his attitudes. While this was going on, the federal government was continuing to pass civil rights legislation. Unfortunately, it was civil rights legislation that was hardly ever enforced down in the South. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 outlawed segregation in public places. The South avoided this by simply getting rid of the public places or privatizing public places. The 14th Amendment, which had been ratified in 1866 with its famous Due Process Clause, was supposedly going to be used to help African Americans maintain their civil rights. Instead, in such court cases like the slaughterhouse cases, the amendment was used to protect businesses. Essentially, the slaughterhouse cases took place in New Orleans when the city of New Orleans tried to get a handle on all the butcher slaughter places that were going on throughout the city and trying to get them into one location and sanitize the whole process. And the independent abattoirs, which is the French word for slaughterhouse, sued using the 14th Amendment. You also had the 15th Amendment, which of course meant that there would be no discrimination on voting based on race, but it does for the first time mention gender. Now, there was a slight black majority in Louisiana, and the Bourbons now use a variety of tactics to reduce these African Americans to a minority. First, there was bulldozing. That's physical intimidation to keep African Americans from the polls. Lining up a whole bunch of white good old boys along the courthouse steps and saying, "Hey, boy, that's my nice home you got back there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it while you were voting." Or simply shoving them away. Dead slaves who had been freed were kept on the rolls, and whites would cast their votes. And then you had non-state-sponsored black disenfranchisement, doing all sorts of things to make it so that African Americans couldn't vote, like not giving them off on voting days or telling them they'd be fired if they'd miss for voting and things like that. And this caused a lopsided Democratic paper majority in the rural parishes of Louisiana. Now, the Lottery Alliance and the Ring, the political machine, got together and created an alliance of their own in which Edward Burke, who was the head of the lottery faction, and Louis A. Wiltz, the last Roman Catholic governor of Louisiana until 1971, made their alliance. Wiltz was mayor of New Orleans, then he was lieutenant governor under Nichols. He was an ardent supporter of the lottery. Now, the Ring organization was not beholden to business or social groups like the Rex organization or anything like that. It was a patronage organization. It was a political machine, largely Irish politicians. Patronage means giving jobs to political supporters, and they were supported heavily by the working class. Another Bourbon power center was the James Gang, led by Samuel Lawrence James, the Baron of the convict lease system. They were a group of legislators committed to keeping James in control because then he steered money toward them through the convict lease program. And then, of course, was the lottery itself. Extremely corrupt. The funds from the lottery were often used to bribe officials. At the top was P.G.T. Beauregard and Jubal Early, both ex-Confederate generals. Jubal Early was one of the generals at Gettysburg who was a little bit tardy coming to the battlefield, where they often joked that Early was late. Jubal Early is one of the guys that creates Robert E. Lee into the Marble Man and the Lost Cause theory and so forth. But he was a very good lawyer. He's just a dreadful human being. The lottery operated through interstate traffic via the mail. Nichols attempted to end the lottery, but he was defeated in court. And this led the Bourbons to call the Constitutional Convention of 1879. The Constitution of 1879 was dominated by the Bourbons in the Lottery Ring faction. The Constitution had a massive reduction in property taxes, especially on white landowners who own large plantations and farms. It moderately reduced the state debt. It radically altered the amendment process and it made havoc out of successive constitutions. We're still feeling the effects of that today. It recentered power in the office of the governor, made the governor even more powerful. It did call for the establishment of public schools. This is a sop to the federal government, but then it grossly underfunded those schools. It shortened Nichols' term to 3 years, which was an insult to the moderate Nichols. Nichols then retired from public office in a huff. Wiltz assumed the governorship, but then he died of tuberculosis. The Constitution also managed to extend Edward Burke's term by 1 year.